Welcome back to Almost Above Average. I am Chris McIntyre. So do you remember that time the President of the United States vowed to release all the Epstein files and let the chips fall where they may? Well, the chips fell, just not on him or any of his friends. Meanwhile, Europe is over here speedrunning accountability anytime somebody's name shows up within 3 pages of the Epstein files. Prime ministers are investigated, princes are dragged in for questioning, ministers are resigning, other countries are doing the whole rule of law thing. In the US, we apparently decided the real crime was caring. So today we're going to go country by country and look at what happens when powerful people get named in those files overseas, and then compare it to what happens here, where our president turns up over and over in the documents, and somehow nobody in power ever seems to find a single prosecutable thing. Spoiler, it's not because everyone is suddenly growing a conscience. It's not. All right, so here's the deal. When the Epstein documents started coming out, you'd think every government would lock arms and say, we're going to root out every single person connected to this. They did not do that. But some of them actually tried. They opened investigations, they lifted immunities, they questioned royalty, they forced resignations. They treated it like a scandal, not a scheduling conflict. And then there's the United States, the country that loves to lecture the rest of the planet about human rights. The country whose president, now again in the White House, promised to release everything, name names, and finally get accountability. Instead, what we got was the political version of thoughts and prayers. So let's walk through this country by country. We're going to look at who got named, what showed up in the files, and what their country did about it. And then we'll end with America, where the president who shows up in the same files more than pretty much anybody in power is somehow in charge of deciding how much you and I are allowed to see. What could possibly go wrong? Let's start in the United Kingdom, where the royal motto might as well be, God save the Queen, but the rest of you are screwed. You've got a former prince who shows up in flight logs, photos, and testimony tied to Epstein. He denies any wrongdoing, of course. They always deny the wrongdoing. Everyone's innocent. The plane just ran exclusively on coincidences. But here's the difference. In the UK, that actually had consequences. He lost his title. He got publicly sidelined, and now with the new wave of documents, he's actually being detained and questioned. Is that perfect justice? No. Is it more than we've seen in Washington? 1,000%. And then there's the ex-power broker types. Former ministers and EU officials with cozy relationships, late night phone calls, and meetings that just happen to line up with Epstein's financial generosity. Again, they all swear nothing shady happened. Yet some of them have been arrested, questioned on suspicion of abusing office, and placed under serious investigation. Their careers are on fire, and not in the fun way. So in the UK, if you're powerful and tangled up with Epstein, at a minimum, you're losing titles, jobs, and sleep. File that away for when we get to the United States. Next stop, Norway. You know, that tiny socialist hellscape. Have free healthcare, paid leave, and apparently consequences? A former prime minister, a guy who went on to hold prestigious roles on the international stage, shows up in the documents through meetings, travel, and assorted financial friendships with Epstein. Of course, he insists everything was above board, because when you hang out with a convicted sex offender who runs private island, it's always for the vibes. But what did Norway do? They didn't tweet about it. They didn't strongly word a letter. They lifted diplomatic immunity and hit him with serious corruption charges. He's under formal reputation in Norway is not just dented, it's wrapped around a telephone pole. Contrast that with the land of nobody is above the law, where apparently the only people consistently below the law are the victims. Now let's check in with France, where a former culture minister, big deal, household name, fancy post, shows up with years of contact and financial ties to Epstein. His defense is the standard, I had no idea what he was really like, which is weird because Epstein's conviction for sex crimes was not exactly an indie underground release. French authorities respond by opening investigations into his financial and tax dealings linked to Epstein, and under public pressure, he resigns from a high-profile cultural job. Suddenly, being on Team Epstein is not compatible with being the public face of civilization. And it's not just France. Across Europe, you've got former ministers, ambassadors, and assorted very important men being forced to answer questions, sit for interviews under caution, and in some cases, watch their careers implode because the public actually demands answers. Is Europe perfect? Obviously not. Some are still dodging, some investigations will go nowhere, but there's at least a visible attempt to do something other than a shrug and move on. Again, we'll compare that to the US in a minute. Even smaller countries that barely show up on cable news are doing more. You've got places in Eastern Europe and the Baltics where law enforcement opened up trafficking probes when they saw evidence of young women being recruited and routed into Epstein's orbit. Not exactly global superpowers, but they still recognized, hey, this looks like organized crime. Maybe we should investigate it. Good on ya. Imagine that. I see evidence of trafficking, go after the traffickers. Revolutionary concept. And now the United States of America, home of the brave, land of the free, and apparently a sanctuary city for anyone powerful enough to show up in the Epstein files. The US has more resources than all those other countries combined. We have federal prosecutors, intelligence agencies, and a Justice Department that can pull your phone records from 8 years ago if you parked slightly wrong near a protest. But when it comes to the Epstein network, suddenly everybody's arms are too short to box with the billionaires. So what do we actually have? A massive dump of documents showing relentless contact with US presidents, ex-presidents, billionaires, cabinet-level officials, media executives, and finance guys. A lot of "I barely knew him," or "I just hitched a ride on a plane," or "I thought the private island was for charity work," and federal officials insisting there's no smoking gun client list they can use to bring cases. Meanwhile, one American name shows up again and again. On flight logs, in social circles, in documents, and that person is currently sitting in the Oval Office after personally promising to release the files and let the truth out. And what happened once he had the power to actually do it? Miraculously, his enthusiasm cooled the second he became the guy whose name appears in those same files over and over. It turns out if you put someone with that much exposure in charge of transparency, you don't get transparency, you get redactions. Regular Americans get prosecuted for text messages. Powerful Americans appear tied to one of the largest child sex trafficking operations we've ever seen. And their worst punishment is in their awkward press conference. Maybe. Other countries are detaining princes and charging ex-prime ministers. We're electing people whose names are in the paperwork and then asking them to decide how much of it we're allowed to see. That is bananas. It's not a justice system. Protection racket with better branding. So let's be crystal clear about what this all means. When a scandal this big breaks and other countries investigate, charge, and at least try to hold their elites accountable, that tells you their system might be corrupt, but it's not completely hopeless. People can still be embarrassed, careers can still end. When the exact same scandal hits the United States and almost nothing happens to the people whose names show up over and over, including the president who swore he would release the files, that tells you the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Protect the powerful from the consequences of what they do to the powerless. Everybody loves to say never again about abuse like this. Never again doesn't mean anything if the people who enabled it are still running the country, still writing the laws, and still deciding what you're allowed to know. So yeah, other countries are far from perfect, but now when it comes to Epstein, they're at least pretending to care. America isn't just failing that basic test. We put one of the most frequently mentioned names from the files back into the White House and handed him the keys to the evidence room. If you think that's normal, that's the problem. If you don't, then your job, our job, is to continue asking the same they really hate. Who are you protecting and why? If you found this breakdown useful, please hit subscribe, please hit like and leave a comment. I would love to see your thoughts. This is Almost Above Average. I am Chris McIntyre. We'll see you on the next one. Peace.